For many, restoring a classic motorcycle is a labor of love, a meticulous journey back in time, bringing a piece of history roaring back to life. One man, a vintage bike enthusiast with a passion for British engineering, thought he had found his dream project, a beautifully aged Triumph Bonneville from the late 1960s. He purchased it from a private seller, excited to get his hands greasy and uncover the soul of this legendary machine. As he began the painstaking process of stripping the bike down to its frame, cleaning and polishing every component, he noticed a peculiar weld on the underside of the fuel tank. It looked out of place, a crude addition to the otherwise elegant lines of the vintage tank. Curious, he decided to investigate further. What he discovered hidden deep within the fuel tank was not rust or old fuel residue, but a carefully concealed metal box. And inside that box lay a collection of items that unlocked a decades-old mystery, hinting at a clandestine past and putting him in possession of secrets that some people might still kill to protect. But before we start our story, smash that like button, make sure you're subscribed, and hit the notifications bell so you won't miss any of our new, incredible stories. To truly appreciate this story, we need to understand the allure and the legacy of the Triumph Bonneville. Launched in 1959, the Bonneville quickly became an icon of the British motorcycle industry and a symbol of rebellious cool around the world. Named after the famous Bonneville salt flats in Utah, where speed records were regularly broken, the bike embodied speed, style, and a certain rugged individualism. Its parallel twin engine produced a distinctive roar, and its sleek design, often featuring gleaming chrome and vibrant paintwork, made it instantly recognizable. The Bonneville was ridden by movie stars like Steve McQueen, became a favorite of motorcycle gangs, and played a starring role in countless cultural moments of the 1960s. Owning and restoring a Bonneville is not just about having a motorcycle, it's about connecting with a legendary past. Our protagonist, whom we'll call Mark, was one such enthusiast. He had spent years restoring various vintage motorcycles and had a particular fondness for British bikes. When he came across a listing for a 1968 Triumph Bonneville, he knew he had to have it. The bike was in decent, unrestored condition, showing the patina of age but appearing largely complete. The seller, an older gentleman who claimed to have owned it for many years, seemed genuine and provided a plausible, if somewhat vague, history of the motorcycle. Mark paid a fair price and trailered the Bonneville back to his workshop, eager to begin the restoration. The first stage of any restoration is disassembly. Mark meticulously began taking the bike apart, carefully cataloging and photographing each component. He cleaned years of grime from the engine, polished the chrome fenders, and began stripping the faded paint from the fuel tank. It was during this process that he noticed the unusual weld. It was located on the bottom of the tank near the rear mounting point, and it was a messy, uneven weld that clearly hadn't been done at the factory. It looked like someone had added something to the tank, or perhaps repaired a significant dent in a very crude way. Curiosity piqued, Mark tapped on the area around the weld. Unlike the solid thud he expected from the metal tank, this section sounded slightly hollow. He ran his hand over the surface and could feel a subtle irregularity. He initially dismissed it as a poorly executed repair, something he would address during the restoration process. However, the more he looked at it, the more convinced he became that there was more to it than just a bad weld. He decided to take a closer look. Using a variety of tools, Mark carefully began to grind away the excess weld material, being extremely cautious not to damage the original tank. As he worked, he uncovered a small, rectangular outline beneath the crude weld. It appeared to be a seam, almost perfectly disguised. This wasn't a repair, it was a deliberate modification. Someone had cut a section out of the bottom of the fuel tank and then welded it back, very poorly, in an attempt to hide the modification. Now, deeply intrigued, Mark knew he had to see what was inside. He carefully widened the seam with a thin blade, working slowly and methodically. Finally, the small rectangular section came loose. He peered into the opening, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness inside the fuel tank. It was not empty. Tucked away in the recess was a small metal box. It was old and slightly rusted, but it was clearly intentionally placed there. With a sense of anticipation and a growing unease, Mark carefully extracted the metal box from the fuel tank. It was roughly the size of a cigarette case, made of thin, tarnished steel. There was no latch or hinge visible. It seemed to be sealed shut. He took it over to his workbench, his mind racing with possibilities. What could be so important that someone would hide it inside the fuel tank of a motorcycle, disguised with a crude weld? drugs, money. He tried to pry it open with a screwdriver, but the box was sealed tight. Finally, he resorted to a small metal cutter, carefully snipping along the seam where the lid appeared to meet the base. With a soft groan of protesting metal, the box sprang open. Mark held his breath and peered inside. It wasn't filled with stacks of cash or bags of white powder. Instead, he found a collection of small, disparate items. There was a tightly folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. There was a small, tarnished brass key. There was a black and white photograph of a young man in what looked like a military uniform. And finally, there was a small, intricately carved wooden token. Mark carefully removed the items and laid them out on his workbench. They looked old, significant, but their purpose was a complete mystery. He unfolded the piece of paper. It was a letter, written in faded ink, in a language he didn't immediately recognize. The script was European, but not English, French, or German. The photograph showed a handsome young man with a serious expression, wearing what appeared to be a uniform from the 1940s or 50s, possibly Eastern European. The brass key was small and looked like it might open a lockbox or a drawer. The wooden token was smooth and worn, its carvings intricate but indecipherable. A shiver ran down Mark's spine. This wasn't just some forgotten trinket. These items felt important, like pieces of a puzzle. He carefully photographed everything and started trying to decipher the letter. He scanned it and used online translation tools, eventually identifying the language as Czech. The translation was fragmented and poetic, hinting at love, loss, and a sense of urgency. One phrase stood out: "The package is secure. The iron horse carries the secret." The iron horse, the motorcycle. The secret was hidden within the bike. But what secret? And why hide it so carefully? The military uniform in the photograph now took on a new significance. Could this motorcycle have been used for something more than just riding? Could it have been involved in espionage or some kind of clandestine operation during the Cold War era? The late 1960s, when his Bonneville was made, was a time of intense geopolitical tension. The thought was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. He was now in possession of a mystery that spanned decades and possibly held dangerous connections. The restoration of his dream motorcycle had just taken a very unexpected and potentially perilous turn. He knew he had to dig deeper to unravel the story behind the hidden box and its cryptic contents. His quiet weekend project had just become a real-life historical thriller. The silence of Mark's workshop was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with the weight of a secret history. The scent of oil and metal was now mixed with the phantom scent of old paper and a half-century of unanswered questions. He sat on a stool, staring at the 4 small items laid out on his workbench: the cryptic letter, the faded photograph of the young soldier, the small brass key, and the enigmatic wooden token. These were not random objects. They were the carefully chosen mementos of a life that had been abruptly interrupted. A story that had been sealed away in darkness, waiting for a mechanic's curiosity to bring it back into the light. The phrase from the translated letter echoed in his mind: "The iron horse carries the secret." He now knew that his beautiful 1968 Triumph Bonneville was more than just a classic motorcycle. It was a time capsule, a clandestine vessel with a hidden past. And he realized that to truly restore the bike, he would first have to restore its story. His investigation had to begin with the year the motorcycle was made, 1968. This was not just any year. It was one of the most turbulent and pivotal years of the 20th century. And in Czechoslovakia, the country from which the letter originated, 1968 was a year of incredible hope, followed by devastating heartbreak. It was the year of the Prague Spring. After 2 decades of oppressive, Soviet-backed communist rule, a new leader, Alexander Dubček, came to power. He began a series of daring reforms, seeking to create what he called socialism with a human face. He loosened the state's grip on the economy, granted greater freedom of speech and of the press, and allowed for more open political debate. A wave of optimism and creative energy swept across the nation. For a few brief, beautiful months, it seemed as though Czechoslovakia was on a path to a more open and democratic future, a new spring of freedom. But this blossoming of liberty was watched with growing alarm and fury by the hard-line communist leaders in the Soviet Union. They saw the Prague Spring as a dangerous infection that could spread to other Eastern Bloc countries, threatening their iron-fisted control over the region. On the night of August 20th, 1968, the dream was brutally crushed. Over 200 Zero troops and thousands of tanks from the Soviet Union and other Warsaw Pact nations stormed across the border, invading Czechoslovakia to normalize the situation. The citizens of Prague mounted brave but futile acts of nonviolent resistance, but they were no match for the overwhelming military force. The Prague Spring was over. What followed was a harsh crackdown. The reformist leaders were removed from power, and a new repressive pro-Soviet regime was installed. A period of purges began. Anyone associated with the reform movement, intellectuals, artists, students, and even soldiers, was targeted by the secret police, the Saint B. Thousands were arrested, fired from their jobs, or forced into exile. It was a time of intense paranoia and fear, a time when a person's life could be ruined by a single misplaced word or a past association. It was a time when people would do anything to escape. With this dark historical context in mind, the items on Mark's workbench began to make more sense. The young man in the military uniform was likely a soldier in the Czechoslovakian army who had supported the reforms of the Prague Spring. When the Soviets invaded, he would have been branded a traitor, a political dissident marked for persecution. He would have had to flee for his life. Mark decided he needed a full, professional translation of the letter. He found a Czech cultural center in a nearby city and, through them, was connected with an elderly university professor who had lived through that very era. Mark sent him high-resolution photos of the letter. A few days later, the professor called him back, his voice filled with emotion. He confirmed that the letter was a farewell note written by a young man named Tomáš to his lover, a woman named Lena. Tomáš wrote that he had to leave the country immediately, that he was being hunted, and that he could not risk her safety by contacting her again. He told her he was leaving something important behind for their future, something hidden. The letter ended with the heartbreaking line, "Look for me in the west, my love, and wait for the Iron Horse to bring us together again." Next, Mark turned his attention to the photograph. He posted the image on several online forums dedicated to military history and Cold War-era studies. Within days, he received a response from a historian in Prague. The expert confirmed the uniform was that of a non-commissioned officer in the Czechoslovakian People's Army from the 1960s. More specifically, he identified the insignia as belonging to a signals or communications unit. This was a crucial detail. A soldier in a signals unit would have access to sensitive information, making him a high-value target for the secret police and a potentially valuable asset for Western intelligence agencies. Now, Mark understood the man and his motive for escape. But what about the key and the wooden token? And what was the secret the Iron Horse was carrying? The box of mementos was a personal treasure, but it didn't seem to be the great secret itself. Prompted by the letter, Mark began to re-examine the motorcycle with new eyes. He was no longer just looking for mechanical flaws. He was searching for hiding places. He checked the hollow tubes of the frame, tapping them to listen for any inconsistencies. He removed the seat and checked its underside. He inspected the old leather tool roll that came with the bike. Inside the tool roll, tucked away behind a set of old wrenches, he found it. It was a small, cylindrical object sealed at both ends with wax. It was a tube for holding microfilm. His hands shaking, he carefully broke the wax seals and tipped the contents out onto a clean cloth. It was a small, tightly wound roll of photographic negative film, microfilm. This was the real secret. The box in the fuel tank was a decoy, or perhaps a collection of personal items too precious to be left behind. But the true package was the microfilm. Mark didn't have a microfilm reader, but he took the roll to a specialist photography lab. The technician carefully mounted the old, brittle film and projected the images onto a screen. They were not personal photos. They were documents, pages and pages of them, all written in Czech. Mark photographed every single frame and sent them to the professor in the Czech Republic. The professor's response came a week later, and it was filled with astonishment. The microfilm contained photocopies of official St. B documents. It was a list of named Southern soldiers, politicians, and intellectuals who were part of the reformist movement, who were scheduled to be arrested and purged by the new regime. Tomáš, the soldier, had not just been escaping, he had been a whistleblower. He was smuggling out proof of the brutal crackdown to the West, a list that could have been used to warn others or to expose the regime's crimes to the world. The full tragic story now clicked into place. In the chaos following the 1968 invasion, Tomáš, a young soldier in a signals unit, knew he was a marked man. He decided to flee. His official army motorcycle, a powerful British-made Triumph Bonneville, was his perfect escape vehicle. He hid the damning microfilm in the tool roll and his most precious personal mementos in the hidden compartment in the fuel tank. He somehow managed to cross the fortified borders of the Eastern Bloc and make his way to the West, likely to Great Britain. The brass key and the wooden token were probably part of his escape plant key for a post office box or a locker where he was supposed to leave the microfilm for a contact and the token to identify himself to a helper in an escape network. But something must have gone wrong. Perhaps he was being watched. Perhaps he ran out of money. For whatever reason, he never delivered the microfilm. He sold the motorcycle, the Iron Horse, to the man who eventually sold it to Mark. And then Tomasz and his story disappeared from history. Mark was now the custodian of this incredible secret. He faced a profound moral dilemma. What should he do with this information? The names on that list belonged to real people. Releasing them could have unforeseen consequences for their families. Even decades later, he decided that the story belonged not to him, but to the Czech people. He contacted the Czech history professor again. Together, they made an anonymous donation of the entire collection: the microfilm, the letter, the photo, the key, and the Tokento, a historical archive in Prague that specialized in documenting the crimes of the communist era. The story of Tomasz, the brave soldier, would now be preserved by his own people. Mark was left with the motorcycle. He now looked at it in a completely new light. It was no longer just a classic machine of steel and chrome. It was a monument. It was a vessel of secrets, a chariot of escape, and a testament to the courage of a young man who had risked everything for freedom. He completed the restoration, but with a new sense of purpose and reverence. Every polished piece of chrome, every tightened bolt was an act of remembrance. When he finally finished, the 1968 Triumph Bonneville was pristine, a beautiful machine roaring back to life. But only Mark knew its true story, the silent, secret history it had carried in its iron heart for over half a century. Thank you so much for watching. If you were captivated by this incredible story of a hidden past, please don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell so you never miss our next amazing story.